episode of Safari Talk. I don't know who I am. My name is Beks Ndlovu. I'm the CEO and founder of African Bush Camps, a safari company operating in Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. We started these Safari Talks the first week of April this year, and we considered tackling tourism topics that spoke to the pandemic and kick off on occasional conversations, but on receiving a very high demand from our viewers and social media followers, after wrapping up our first Safari Talk, Safari Talks has become a regular feature on our social media radar. And of course, this is our third month in, and we're still going strong. And really, it's about getting to the bones and dissecting important matters that are impacting us, our partners, and the media. Thank you for supporting our talks this far, sharing your ideas, and keeping us engaged in the most important issues during these uncertain times. And if you'd like to remain informed on upcoming episodes, combined with our sister program, Conversations with Beks, on Instagram, please follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You may have noticed that normally we have these in the evenings, 7 o'clock, cat time. We are making adjustments so that we can accommodate many people whose time zones are perhaps a little bit difficult. So from this point going forward, we'll be airing Safari Talks at earlier day slots to accommodate mums, dads, and those who are having post-workday matters, or maybe running offline errands, or enjoying their sundowners. Diving into it, we just want to thank Alistair Kreft, Under the Influence, who've been very generous in sponsoring us with various company, and they also supply all the beverages for our safari camp. So Alistair, thank you very much for your ongoing support. If you want for which I have become a recipient. Thanks, Alistair. So the adoption rate although many of us have effort into it, it's very clear that during this time of crisis, people are really stepping up that they can contribute during this particular period of time when our areas are quite vulnerable. It exists now pretty much everywhere. It's a rarity for tourism operators to shy away from the subject and from being involved with a cause to save wildlife, keep the environment unscathed, and build stronger communities. Conservation is foundational. It's at the core of a cycle of events, especially when the development of conservation-minded hospitality creates a network of job opportunities. It provides local communities with a reason to conserve as they will have a real return for their efforts. And it's linked to education. I always say that, you know, we can't be complaining about current leadership if we're not investing in future leaders. But it's also economic opportunities that extend to the scope of conservation players, and so that everyone in the tourism ecosystem sees the benefit of preserving our fauna and flora. It delighted a significant growth. Minded individual world and have this insightful discussion. I want to introduce you first to Colin Nagy, who I met a few weeks ago. He's joining us from New York. Welcome, Colin. Just a little bit about Colin before I hand you over to the industry's most read commentators on hospitality, luxury, and innovation. A regular columnist for national US, international publications such as Skift, Korea, The Guardian. He's noted in our outlets, including the New York Times, the Financial Times, and Monocle. He is also head of strategy for the New York branch of Fred and Farid, multi-awarded independent creative, LA, Paris, and Shanghai. And Colin, of course, visited us in our camps. You'll have to remind me when that was, Colin, but you did enjoy the, I believe, a number of months ago.
Yeah.
Before we go into it, and before I introduce you to Matt, that was December last year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, hopefully I've got Colin there. And Matt, just a little bit of Matt. He's a master of sorts. He juggles a number of things. But aside from being a seasoned conservationist, focused filmmaker for his film production company, he's got a company called the Rasta McCrory. He is also a livelihood restoration planning consultant, the managing director at Future Water Bars, and co-founder of Conservation Storytelling. These gentlemen are best to introduce themselves with a little bit of their background and perhaps what they're currently working on. Colin, do you want to maybe start by letting us know your particular interest in conservation space is very intriguing. Do you want to maybe speak a little bit about that to us?
Sure. I've been writing about various topics related to hospitality, travel, innovation for a long time with Skift. I think it's going on 5 or 6 years. And I write for a lot of other publications, but what's interesting about Skift is it's a cool platform for me to report and write on a lot of different topics. And I've spent a decent amount of time in Africa, and I'm almost kind of reporting from a little bit of an outsider perspective. I didn't grow up there. I've done several trips to several places, but I'm kind of coming in with a beginner's mind. And I think what's interesting is looking at some of the existential issues related to conservation, related to tourism, but also seeing sort of the positive cycles that come from people visiting. So I've just been writing several articles and columns examining every element of this, from the tourism standpoint, from a leadership standpoint, ecological standpoint, and also conservation. So it's been a pleasure to dig in and talk to really interesting people and leaders in lots of different places, including entrepreneurs like yourself, wonderful guides. I actually was out with Calvet, one of your fantastic guides. And so, every time I come, I try to dig and meet new people and get new perspectives.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Colin. Matt, tell us how you got into this space and what your focus is. You speak very passionately as a Zimbabwean about conservation, and you started having many faceted conversations with different people, including a conversation that we had not so long ago. Do you want to maybe give us a little bit of your background?
Thanks very much, Beks. And I think you did mention there's a lot of caps that I do wear in my day-to-day. But primarily my occupation has been in livelihoods restoration, working with communities that basically live on the edge, or marginalized communities on the edge of large investments or protected areas such as national parks. So a lot of my experience in the realm came through working hands on a day-to-day basis with these communities. And alongside that, developing my filmmaking side. So now I do both together. And pretty much at the start of this pandemic, so it's been ongoing for a couple of years, but having the fortunate ability to be able to be on the ground with a diverse range of people who are in the conservation sector, either telling their story through film or actually dealing with them in a livelihoods manner. What I noticed was there's a lot of stories that are missing the slipstream, basically. And getting these voices and these conversations out there was something that I've always wanted to do. And at the beginning of this COVID pandemic, a lot of my thoughts evolved around what is going to happen to the funding aspect around conservation. What is the future of it going to look like? Because I think for the first time globally, there's definitely a sense of solidarity in the conservation sector where everyone has had a uniform impact or been affected in the same way. So a lot of the conversations have been around the funding, with project leaders, with project implementers, and of course the tourism sector like yourselves. So it's been a great few months, and the conversations are still going.
That's great. I mean, I think the one thing that we could all agree on is that, we have a common weave, which is about storytelling. And I think all our passions are about bringing to the surface the stories and the successes and the many things that are being done on the ground by various people that so many people out there don't know about. And from our point of view, being a safari operator, we really appreciate all the multimedias and all the channels that we're able to access through the work that both of you do. And both of you, of course, work in the space of multimedia and sharing content with readers and viewers. How do you want to maybe just talk a little bit? It's not really about the pandemic, but obviously we need to acknowledge that a lot of what we're doing today is being heavily impacted. Do you want to maybe, starting with Colin, tell us how the pandemic influenced your focus, your specific focus in the work that you're doing now, and of course your angles on the messages on the conservation efforts that you've recently shared with people out there?
I think the existential problem here is that the pandemic, particularly in the States, has basically dominated every possible news cycle. It's still bad and it's starting to get worse. And I think the challenge here is how do brands such as yourself kind of keep the topics of conservation back, into the discourse, because everything is kind of getting flooded out. And what happens during something like this is people revert into their own sort of super primal interests, and sometimes some of the things that they've supported in the past can kind of go on the back burner. So I think I'm heartened by seeing some of the creative things that the safari industry has been doing in terms of whether it's some of the virtual game drives, conversations like this, lots of kind of full court press from the marketing side to make sure that these notions of conservation are front and center. Because if this stuff drops off the radar completely, it's a disaster. So I think that that's the big thing for me. Yeah. I'm actually working on a story right now about a lot of these initiatives that camps, individuals, guides are trying to do to keep the narrative back on track. So.
Can I add in there?
Yeah, sure.
Great, thanks, Colin. I completely agree with you. There's been a lot of innovative adoptions into keeping businesses alive, essentially, and we're seeing quite a lot of it coming from the tourism sector. And what I think a pro out of all of this has been the highlight of the holistic approach that conservation has in the tourism realm, if it were, that what people weren't necessarily aware of before about where their dollars were going or how big their impact, aside from just visiting a wild space in Africa, was, how much of an overflow their contribution was making. And I think a lot of people now are definitely going to be shifting their focus to the communities that have been impacted, the people who have lost their jobs, as well as the preservation of these landscapes. And it's all pretty much amalgamating in one nice little core unit, if you were, which I think has been great.
That's excellent, Matt. You touched on about collaboration earlier on. I think today more than ever, we have seen that during this time of crisis where, as safari operators, we're not fixated on competition. It's almost like we've realized that this pandemic is bringing about a certain stance in us where we all actually have the common enemy that we're trying to fight. And at the same time, we're also fighting for the same spaces that provide so much livelihoods for our staff and for the surrounding communities. And that shift, I think, going forward is something that I think is going to be very powerful, where people come together to look at the holistic landscape as opposed to the actual silos, of which, let's face it, we all have our different foundations and our different not-for-profit organizations. And I think most of us are doing a great job. If you look at 25 years ago, if you were a safari operator, you were a safari operator. That was your focus, was tourism. And there were people in the sector of conservation, researchers, and that's what they'll be focusing on. There are no hard cut lines anymore. Safari operators, we feel that our role is not just tourism, but in fact, half of what we do as a business is the business of conservation. And it's about being able to tell these stories. One of the key things, obviously, that is of concern, and you touched on it a little bit, Matt, is that we've seen how vulnerable these areas are. We've seen how vulnerable relying on tourism numbers, relying on donor funding to fund our conservation efforts. And with no tourism over the last 3 months, and possibly very little to no tourism in the coming months, we need to be coming up with collectively with long-term financial solutions from our partners in conservation. And I think this is something that we've spoken about. Are you seeing anything out there, any innovative ideas as to how funding could look like in terms of long-term financial support for conservation?
Thanks, Beks. I think there's been, so a lot of the conversations that I had, as I mentioned, the conversations centered around the funding aspect behind conservation. At the end of the day, conservation is a business, and it does need some sort of revenue stream coming in, and we do need to diversify. What we have seen is obviously the heavy reliance on tourism. And I've spoken to people in the tourism sector, the donor-funded sector, as well as people who rely on voluntourism to contribute towards their conservation efforts. And it's still very early in the conversation to be able to tell there are people coming together. I've been approached by a couple of external bodies who are looking at alternative ways as to how to divert the role from, or the reliance on tourism, reliance on donor funding. How can we diversify the income for conservation on a broader scale and look at something a lot more sustainable in the long term? There's been basically what I have noticed, and through the conversations that I've had, is donor funding seems to be pretty much reliant on your relationship with your donor at this stage. If you've got a good relationship with your donors, you're fine, you're going to carry on. They see this as a little speed hump in the road type thing, where we see a far greater impact where tourism is like completely absorbed out of the equation and there's nothing left. So I think it's very difficult to put a finger on one specific source coming in, but it is definitely a holistic approach and a diverse approach to getting funding in. And in terms of anything new, there are people out there who are thinking long and hard. It's these conversations that we are having, being a part of many a webinar now, where the conversation around this is just growing and growing. And I believe that there's a lot of young and passionate African conservationists who are coming through now with good ideas. And I look forward to the next couple of months, year, 2 years, to hear these ideas coming through, as this is probably one of the biggest challenges that they all face, and something that they can contribute to and probably change the face of conservation in Africa.
That's great, Matt. And of course, one of the things that is going to be quite a big deal, is the role of the trade and people that sell tourism, outbound tourism, out of places like the US. Colin, where you are you seeing people, or are you hearing about people having conversations now about the need to really focus on choosing wisely and being responsible with their traveling, to the extent that they're being very careful with doing their research as to where they spend their money? So your readership in all the publications that you're involved with, I'm assuming that there is a collective effort by the industry, by people even in the media, to really educate the average reader that it's very important going forward that when people are going in a particular place, there are some hard questions asked about how responsible that organization is in terms of being able to give back to communities and also add to biodiversity.
Yeah, I think that the issue here is there's multiple different types of audiences. So there's the people that are thinking about doing a once-in-a-lifetime safari because it's on their bucket list, and they've delegated that information to someone else, and they're basically just going to go with something that looks as glamorous as possible. However, the positive news is I think that there are more people that are turning the notion of going out into the bush from like a once-in-a-year thing to once-in-a-lifetime thing to something more frequent. And this audience of people that care a little bit more about the provenance, care a little bit more about the entire ecosystem, these are the ones that are the most important, because these are the people that are actually going to be digging in, doing the research, understanding the how the tourism dollars are being spent, and are thinking about, hey, this is a great opportunity for me to relax with my family. However, I know that my spend on this substantial trip is actually going to do other things. So I want to know exactly what those other things are. So I think that the safari operators, the hospitality brands need to continue doing a job, which is to tell those stories, not only the bright and sunny marketing stories with the beautiful photos, but more of the backstories of how tourism dollars helped fund this anti-poaching center or help this community, or how, as we'll talk about in a second, how we're creating a sustainable business and sustainable ecosystem for people to have upward mobility and to create careers. So I think it's a double-edged sword. The industry in Africa needs to do a better job sometimes at telling these stories of where the tourism dollars are going, and then the audience needs to be more educated and ask the right questions.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk about the industry needs to do better in telling the stories. You're absolutely right, and I think more than anything else, in the past, you flick back 25 years ago, the stories of conservation were not really told by Africans, people that actually come from the very place where the wildlife is. And I think one of the narratives that we're seeing, and certainly, it's very close to my heart, and being able to tell my own personal story of my personal journey of why the interest in wildlife, why the interest in communities. And I think for a very long time, many people with the stories, as Matt said earlier on, didn't really have the platform and the place to be able to tell those stories, which are more impactful. And when it comes to fundraising, which we also talked about a little bit earlier on, we really believe that tourism is that key. It's that magic key that will work alongside in order to save these places. And when we talk about tourism, we talk about it as a growth industry, and you've written a bit about that. You wrote an article not so long ago where you say the most relevant and existential question here is, how do we turn conservation into a growth industry? And I think for a very long time, tourism hasn't really been seen as a career for a lot of people. And certainly, if you look at we've got over 600 employees throughout the group operating in 4 countries. And in both Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Zambia, our staff are all locals. And these are all people that have grown up pretty much in the same background and settings as I have, certainly for the first 6 years of my life. And there's so much to be told in stories. And that's something that we're promoting. And hopefully, these exposures that Matt is having will also result in deep conversations with people out in rural communities. I don't know how much of that is actually work that is focused on rural communities, Matt. Maybe you can speak a little bit into some of the engagements that you're seeing in community areas.
Thanks, Beks. I think we've actually, touched wood, if we're allowed to get out of the country, we'll be driving across Chirundu hopefully next month. But we're going to be spending, so both Mana and I as conservation storytelling, we're going to be joining a friend up there who's about to engage on a long walk from the top of North Luangwa down to the South Luangwa along the Luangwa River. A 350-kilometer walk, in which is to raise funds for these particular communities been displaced, or we've been put out of a livelihood essentially, and to raise awareness. So during this time, I haven't been able to have a direct contact with people, with the actual communities on the ground. It's the only voice that I'm missing. We're talking a lot on behalf of the communities and the assumptions. But what I hope to do with that is bring out a little bit more of the reality on the ground as to what it is that is happening. Going forward, I think, like Colin, you were mentioning about visitors now being more aware of where their dollar is going and things. And obviously there's the day-to-day livelihood in the tourism industry with employment on the ground. I think what would be lovely to see going forward, going forward is more of an enabling platform for people with potential in the safari realm to uplift themselves and take that extra step further. Like yourself, Beks, and your story that you've had, it takes just that one little step to be able to break the mold. And I think there needs a little bit, just going forward in the future, some sort of platform where these people can be identified and enabled.
That's great, Matt. I think that's focus of the future. And Colin, I would be interested to understand, I mean, from your readership, do you think that your readership has somewhat changed during this period of time? Because obviously, our viewers will have to be patient with us today, and I think that's probably my connection, which is not great today. But what I was saying, Colin, is are you seeing a different reach to certain places through the publications that you share? Because I should imagine the whole idea would be that different people read these publications and not just, the reach like for new readership in places where we want to reach out. There's a sense of awareness so that when people think of any kind of travel, not just to Africa, are having that sense of responsibility about the places that they choose.
Yeah, I think that to answer your question directly, I think that at Skift there's a much bigger sort of audience that's not just the usual suspects that would be reading the publication. Also, as I'm writing about some of these industry things and tourism things, I do think that people are one of the recurring themes I'm seeing is people are completely rethinking how they want to travel and what they want out of their travel. So that's something that I've been covering and actually has been resonating quite a bit with our audience. Is people have completely realigned what they want to do, and I think that there's going to be much more emphasis on the sensory, much more emphasis on the kind of reconnection to nature, and a lot more emphasis on doing things that actually have soul and impact, as opposed to just perhaps a glitzy, glamorous, show-off vacation. So I think that, as we move out of this difficult phase, I think that there's been a huge realignment in terms of how people are prioritizing certain things. So I would like to say that that's going to benefit Africa. I would like to say that that's going to benefit your industry, but I think that there's going to be some latency in when this happens. I think that a lot of people from the US aren't going to be hopping on the next Emirates flight or the next Delta flight to Cape Town for reasons of border control, but also reasons of kind of reluctance. So I think what has to happen now is all of the communication, all of getting the song and story straight within the entire industry. And I like what you said about things not having to be a competition. I think that people need to band together for a common cause of articulating some of this stuff. And it's no longer a competition between camp to camp, but it's almost like an existential, threat to the entire industry. So people need to come together. But I do think that because of this realignment of what travelers actually want, being in fresh air, seeing the stars, hearing the hiss of the bush, and being very connected to our most basic selves is going to be super, super attractive. And I really, really hope that we get back to that sooner rather than later.
I think
Colin, I like that. I like the fact that you talk a little bit about open spaces, such as those around our destinations in Africa, there's a lot of discussions at the moment, of course, happening simultaneously about some of the places around the world where we've seen and those places have experienced over-tourism, which of course ends up destroying the very asset that people are trying to protect or promote. We talk about places like Venice, for example, where people come in by ship and spend 2 hours sweating the asset and then leave it far worse off without spending an awful lot of money there. So I think we are seeing a different shift in conversations within the trade, where we're now starting to encourage people to travel less in terms of actual movement when they get to the destination, so that they can actually get far much deeper into being able to explore communities where they are. So in other words, coming on safari and spending 2 nights in one place and then going to another place for 2 nights, and by the end of a 2-week period, you've covered sort of 5 different destinations. We're questioning the responsibility around that, and certainly we've got the free spaces, we've got the open spaces that are a lot more conducive to the order of the day, certainly around this pandemic. Colin, is there a particular place that you think you want to travel to, or that you've got a commission to travel to as soon as you can?
You know, I've spent a lot of time, not as much time as you both, but I've spent a good amount of time in Zimbabwe, and I think that that is truly one of my favorite places to go. So as I've been kind of desk bound, I've been really thinking a lot about that, because I think to the outside world, and I've written about this in Skift, because of the political situation and economic situation, Zimbabwe seems like kind of a scary place. But when you actually get there, when you see the amazing conservation work that's done in multiple areas of the country, when you see the quality of the guides, like your colleague Calvet, who I was out with, when you see the people and the amazing land, it's a place that I really want to return to. There's lots of areas in Africa, but that's very high up on my list. And I'm not just saying that because you're both from there. I would say that anyway.
Yeah.
And I was in Rwanda earlier this year. I thought that was spectacular, and I also thought that they were very thoughtful in terms of how they're building a longer term sort of tourism and getting away from just the bucket list gorilla trip to something longer. And I love what you said, Beks, about let's be more mindful. Let's go deeper. Let's not just go and check things off the list, but let's actually go longer and immerse ourselves and really get a feeling and spend time with people and spend time in nature and not be so harried. And I'm very guilty of that. When you look at a lot of my trips, it's 2 days in Hong Kong, 2 days in Shanghai, 2 days in Chengdu, 2 days in Tokyo, and then I'm home. And I'm really thinking about being a little bit more slow and mindful in terms of how I travel. So I'm excited to get back out. I think that it's gonna take a while, but I'm optimistic about all of this, and I think I'm really hoping for the best, that people want to return to Africa and want to do it in a mindful way, where they're stewards of both where they spend their money and they're stewards of the actual environment and ecosystem.
That's great, Colin. Matt, do you want to just maybe add on to that? And once you finish adding on to that, maybe you can tell us what documentary or what filming or what project you're looking forward to next when you can really get around.
Sure. Colin, you've hit the nail on the head there, and so did you, Beks. But it is ideally about slowing down. This whole pandemic has forced us all to slow down and really appreciate what is valuable. And when we do get out on safari again, is to take the time, slow it down, get off the Ferrari safari, and really absorb it and give it a more mindful approach. At the end of the day, pretty much all the films that they've ever watched on National Geographic that have got them there, those sequences have taken months and a lot of patience to get. Slow it down and you'll experience the same. Don't rush around. actually, this evening, I've got a fantastic conversation with a young lady down in Cape Town. She's also Zimbabwean, but she's an unbelievable woman who's got a bright future in conservation. Her name is Marilyn Nkomo, but she'll be on the next episode of Conservation Storytelling, episode 9. And hopefully with upcoming work next month, if we can, is the short documentary that we're going to be doing on the Walk of the Luangwa Project 2020, in telling the story of not only the walk itself. We'll be on foot for 17 days, walking 350 kilometers through the Luangwas, but telling the story of the organizations that are along the way, as well as the voice of the community, which is exactly what we want to get out at the end of the day.
Gentlemen, you've both been very insightful. Love having these conversations with you both. Thank you very much for all the storytelling that you're both doing, both locally, internationally. Continue to do what you're doing and continue to get the stories out there and raising awareness in our various communities. Thank you for joining the 7th episode of Safari Talks. And thank you to our audience for the support, Under the Influence for your continued sponsorship and support. Thank you very much. It's been great. And I look forward to seeing you both when we can all get out of our houses, out of our countries, and passionate about. Thank you very much to you both. And thank you to the teams.
Thanks for having us.
Cheers.